This is the first lecture in Chapter 9, Nervous System, for Anatomy and Physics. I'm going to be talking about the parts of the nervous system. The first thing you need to know is that nerve cells have a special name that's different from other kinds of cells, and that name is neuron. Anytime you see the root ner, N-E-U-R, we're dealing with the nervous system, usually the brain or the cells of the nervous system themselves. And there are some parts that all neurons have. The first is the cell body, and then there are dendrites and axons. We're going to spend some more time in a few minutes talking about those, so I'm not going to focus on them at this point. There are other cells within the nervous system as well. They're called neuroglial. So these cells are basically there to provide necessary things for the neurons. The neurons do the work of the cell. Of the nervous system, they're responsible for receiving and sending information. The neuroglial cells give food and structural support for the neurons so that they can do their job. Structural support means that it helps these neuroglial cells surround the neuron and help to hold them in place. When you get a bunch of neurons together, for instance, like this, with a whole bunch of neuroglial cells providing support in the area, those big bundles together are called nerves. And that's what we think of as the parts of our body that help to detect changes in the environment. The nervous system is organized into two categories, and those two categories are responsible for detecting changes in the environment, things like temperature or sound, and then responding to those changes. There are two ways that your body communicates between, say, the nerves of your hand and the brain, back and forth. So there are electrical messages, just like the wiring in your house uses electrical messages to communicate from the light switch to the light itself, saying time to turn on the light. And there are chemical messengers as well, which we talked about when we looked at muscles. We talked about neurotransmitters. Hopefully that term is familiar. Neurotransmitters are the chemicals that help to pass messages. When you combine the electrical communication and the chemical communication together, they form a system that's called a nerve impulse. And that can be anything from detecting sound and sight to moving the body to sitting upright. All of those things are controlled by nerve impulses. Your nervous system is divided up into two parts. The central nervous system has just the brain and the spinal cord. So it runs, if this is your brain, it runs along the center of the body. So the brain's in the middle of your head, and then the spinal cord's in the middle of your vertebral column. And then there's the peripheral nervous system, which is everything else. Peripheral just means around the edges. So these are the nerves that are all around the edges of your body. The jobs of the nervous system, again, sensory receptors their function is to detect changes using your senses. So it might be light, it might be hearing, it might be taste, it might be smell, it could be something like pressure or pain, and then to take that information and pass it back to the brain in the form of a nerve impulse, right? Your brain doesn't actually feel pain when you slam your finger in a door, but rather the finger sends a message to the brain telling you that it hurts, and then your brain processes that. It allows your brain to make decisions. So once we realize that something has happened, you can decide what to do about it. Maybe you can move your finger, or you can create a memory that says, geez, next time don't slam your finger in the door. With a lot of sensory activity, so lots of things that you notice or observe, you both make a decision about it, and then that decision takes action. So maybe you move away from the door, you remember that it hurt to slam your finger in the door, and then next time you think about not slamming your finger in the door. So a lot of parts are involved in your body detecting changes. Anytime the body decides to do something physical or alter the inside of the body in order to respond to a stimulation, then a message goes to the effector cells. So in this case, the effector cells would be in your finger, and it tells the muscles of the finger to pull that finger away. There are two kind of general types of effectors. The first one is those that control the physical, kind of the motor parts of the body, and those are called somatic nerves, or the somatic nervous system. Soma means body in Greek. So these are any reactions that are controlled by skeletal muscle. So these are usually voluntary, right? You choose to move your finger, or you choose to go from sitting in a chair to lying on the floor, or whatever. But there are also actions that your body takes when it detects changes that need to be managed internally. So involuntary actions are controlled by the autonomic nervous system. I know it sounds kind of like automatic, but it's a different word, even though it has basically the same meaning. The autonomic nervous system controls things like your heart rate and your breathing and your water levels. And it does so involuntarily. You don't have to think about it. These reactions are much more heavily involved in homeostasis and keeping your body balanced. So I told you early on that the cells that provide support for the neurons are called neuroglial cells. And some of their jobs, in addition to food, right, they give your body food, they provide physical support, which is what I'm saying here with structural framework. That means they provide kind of the shape and the overall kind of neighborhood of the neurons. But then they also have some protective purposes. So they help to make what's called myelin. So in your nerve, let's say this is a neuron. Around the neuron, you have this kind of fatty, soft layer, and that's the myelin. And the myelin acts just like the insulation does on an electrical wire. If you've ever seen an electrical wire or an extension cord, or you've plugged in a blow dryer, right? There's always this kind of plastic sheath around the wire itself, which provides insulation. It keeps the electricity from leaving the cord, and it keeps you safe from touching the electrical cords. Myelin does the same thing for the electrical parts of your body. It provides insulation, and it helps to keep that neuron functioning properly. So that was our second job of the neuroglial cells. The third job is to carry out phagocytosis. So this is for defense against infection. So if there are germs or other harmful agents in the area of the neurons, the neuroglial cells help to defend against that. In the peripheral nervous system, or the part of the body that moves, right? Motor means movement. The neuroglial cells have a specific name called Schwann cells, named for the gentleman who first identified them, but they have the exact same job. They make the myelin sheath just for the cells that tell your body to move specifically. So here you can see the structure of a neuron. This is one single neuron, and it has very predictable parts. So up at this end, this is called the cell body, and it goes all the way here to kind of like that. And it reminds me sort of a tree. It's like the trunk of a tree. And inside the cell body are all of the parts that we would expect in any cell. There's cytoplasm, or, kind of a jelly-like fluid. There's ribosomes and mitochondria and all of those things. There's a very large nucleus because neurons have very important jobs. And then there are these little branches extending out from the cell body. These are the receptors. These are called dendrites, and that word means branch in Greek. So dendrites are the branches that receive information. So whenever your body is getting new information from a different neuron, that message comes here and is delivered to one of these branches, and then it can be zipped into the cell body for some kind of action to take place. You can see that there are tons of dendrites on each cell body, and that's because they're receiving lots and lots of information from a variety of places all at the same time. So there has to be a lot of places for that information to be received. And then extending off the cell body this way is what is called the axon. I'll write that here in red, the axon. And the axon is like the highway for decisions once they're made. So the dendrites receive information, the cell body makes a decision about that information, and then it transfers whatever the decision that's been made. So maybe it is, move your hand. That decision gets transferred all the way down the axon until it reaches the end. This is called the terminal. Terminal means the end, right? The airport terminal is where the hallway ends. So at the terminals, that message is then transferred to a chemical, to a neurotransmitter, where it goes across the synapse to the next neuron or the next muscle, which you learned a little bit about when we talked about muscles, and we'll talk more about that in the coming units. So this is just a continuation of neuron structure, and I told you all of these parts, right? The cell body has mitochondria, other parts called microtubules and things like that. The one thing we haven't mentioned yet is the axon. So here's the axon, here's our cell body up here, and then the terminals at the end. All along the axon is myelin, which we talked about just a minute ago. It's the insulating sheath that keeps the messages in and helps them to be protected. The sheath, however, is not always complete. There are little holes in it. You can think of these sort of like Swiss cheese, right? It's a continuous layer, and then every so often you have a hole. Your neurons are the same way. There are little holes in the myelin, and those